That was new Minnesota Vikings nose tackle Michael Pierce. Matthew Collar, ESPN's Courtney Cronin will be joined later on in the show by Steve Palazzolo of Pro Football Focus, who is kind of enough to offer us guests on a daily basis because their people are all working from home and begging for interaction with other humans. So that we're going to be the beneficiaries of that. Courtney, let's just start out with first reactions to the Michael Pierce signing and then what it means. So give me your take. 3 years, $27 million for Linval Joseph's replacement.
I think it's a good deal for Pierce. I mean, 27 years old. He's shorter. He's younger. He's got less wear and tear on his body. I mean, he is a Linval Joseph prototype. I mean, you are replacing one with the other. Obviously, Linval has a lot to his pedigree. He's a Super Bowl champion. He'd been in this Vikings defense for 6 years. So to say that the fit is going to be seamless, to say it's going to be the exact same player, we're going to have to wait to see how that plays out. But I do think there are a ton of similarities between both Pierce and Joseph and everybody I've spoken with about how he's going to fit into this defense. You know, you couldn't find a better replacement, especially for a team that, needs a little bit of help right now in figuring out how to stop the run. I mean, that was Joseph's pedigree for so long. And they struggled with it. They were a top 20 run-stopping team last year. So Pierce is a top 5 run-stopping nose tackle. I think it's a really good fit. And we knew that Joseph, even though that Rick Spielman put that statement out last week saying that they were going to stay in communication with, both Rhodes and Linval Joseph throughout free agency, it was always apparent to me that he was going to test the market because the Vikings just didn't have enough money to pay him at the price he was going to be at in 2020, which is why they had to go the route of releasing him this past Friday and creating some cap space. I mean, he's at a situation now, though, brand new defense. I mean, he got a pretty good deal for 2 years going out to the Chargers. And, he'll definitely be missed here. But I'm looking forward to getting to learn a little bit more about Michael Pierce and figure out how they're going to implement him in this scheme. But the one thing that is kind of still a little glaring to me, Matthew, is that I was looking up some of the interior defensive linemen pressure grades and stats and just numbers from last year. He and Linval Joseph are nearly identical in that category. And Mike Zimmer did say that there are ways to, quote, manufacture an interior pass rush, which is what they did in New Orleans. We saw with, putting their defensive ends inside on third down. But that's still an area this team needs to figure out how they're going to get better at in 2020. But overall, I think it's a good signing. I mean, they haven't done a whole ton in free agency. I mean, you can include Kirk Cousins' extension and Stephon Diggs and the big movement from Monday, but outside of that and signing guys that were not on their roster last year, this is the only one.
So there's two different ways that I look at this. On the one hand, there's Michael Pierce, the player, and does he fit? He is 340 pounds on a very good day, probably a lot more than that. And a run stuffer as good as there are in the NFL. He can clog the middle and play that nose tackle position. And our buddy Jeremiah Searles tweeted me earlier today about how important the nose guard or nose tackle, whichever you want to call it, is in the Mike Zimmer defense. And I totally believe all that. And I think that having that player helps your linebackers and helps your run fits and all those sorts of football things. So Michael Pierce, good player, thumbs up to you. But the 3-year, $27 million contract for somebody at that position with a team that has literally zero cap space is hard to figure out because it makes you ask, okay, what is next? And why did you fill the position that I would have looked at almost last of all the positions that they need? Why did you fill it first? Maybe because Pierce is available and he's a very good fit. But when I look at some of the other guys and the contracts that they signed, Danny Shelton is a good example of another run-stuffing nose tackle, and he gets a 2-year, $8 million deal, and you're giving Michael Pierce, a hell of a lot more than that. And Michael Pierce, when he's good, is the same as Linval Joseph when Joseph was not that good. When Joseph is at his absolute best, he is elite and he's getting after the passer and all those other things. But Joseph last year, as we saw, did not have a huge impact. And he ends up Pierce ends up being basically graded about the same way. So that's where I would say I like the player, but the amount of money that's spent is hard to figure out how they're going to work around that. Oh, we lost Courtney. How about that? So because of coronavirus, we are broadcasting from different places, and we were disconnected from Courtney. So I just paused for her to jump in. Well, what do you think of that, Courtney? Nothing. Wow. Wow, she's giving me the cold shoulder here on this Michael Pierce take. So I wrote about this for our website today, scorenorth.com, about how they made the move that they could have done last first. And I think the football people would disagree. I'm not sure, Courtney, how much you heard of me going on and on about that. But I think the football people would disagree with my take that this was their last need that they could have filled later on for much cheaper, because Michael Pierce is a beast and he's really good at football. So I'm not contesting that at all. It's just the money situation that they're in makes me say, okay, now what?
Well, I think that they also probably struck out on the corners that they were trying to go after in free agency. The ones that were available were just too expensive. So, yes, they could have addressed this in the draft. I'm with you there. I think that that would have been, an easy way to try to figure out what you're going to do at that nose tackle spot, because you do have Jaleel Johnson, you do have Armon Watts, where you're going to play Jalen Holmes. I mean, you had guys waiting in the wings you probably could have gotten by rotating, which we've seen them do a lot more in the last 2 years. But, to me, this kind of signifies that people have not been agreeing to the terms that have been presented to them, or maybe just saying, no, thanks, we'll pass for some of the offers. I mean, there's a reason that guys like Jadeveon Clowney are still out there right now, because they're asking for too much. And I think what the Vikings have done, at least in what they've prioritized from what I've heard behind the scenes, if they had that type of money, and I throw out Clowney just as an example because he's asking for the world, they would have gone after a top corner. Which leads me to believe that that's been what they've been trying to do behind the scenes. And when they couldn't get that, it's, hey, we have to do something here to try to fix an immediate need on the defensive line, or at least what they believe to be, because they needed to stop the run better. They've really struggled with that in 2019. So, I mean, this addresses it right now, but there will be those who say, but what about the interior pass rush? Well, what about the overall play of the defensive line? I mean, this fixes one thing, I think, right away when you look at how good Pierce has been against the run in previous seasons, and you have a higher ceiling in a player like him because he is younger, he has less wear and tear on his body than Linval Joseph did, but it still leaves you with a multitude of needs. And at this rate, as things are kind of slowing down here, kind of wondering, all right, well, how are all the pieces going to fall into place?
Yeah, that's right. That's where I'm at with this. And no doubt it's a position of need. And I think it's, in a way, like it would be smart if they were chasing after top corners, but they just don't have the money for it. And when Trey Waynes is getting, what is it, like $14 million a year? Yeah, then it's pretty hard to afford any of the top corners. But at the same time, when you're talking about a nose tackle, it feels like one of those positions where you could wait till later on, second, third week, and see if anybody falls, because the other players at that position just don't make this type of money unless they impact the pass. And the thing about Michael Pierce over the last few years, the guy just doesn't even play that much.
Yeah, that's the hard thing. When you're going back to look at the pass rushing numbers and where he falls in that, you have to go, if you look at Pro Football Focus and you try to figure out, where he falls in that, you have to go to a minimum of 20% out of the 573 pass rushing snaps. Like, he is at the very, very low end of it. That's a Linval Joseph type. So that's that leads me to believe they're going to kind of have to do what they did last year and in previous seasons, as we saw Linval's snaps decline. I mean, Mike Zimmer talked about, in ways limiting his playing time, just because that's what you were getting when he was getting on the other side of 30, that it wasn't sustainable. So you're not replacing it with a nose tackle that can be in there 70% of the time. Like, you're replacing it with someone who's very much like Linval Joseph in that sense.
Right. So why are you paying him like someone who's going to play all the time? That's my issue. And so now you have, when we are dealing with the smallest of margins with cap space, you have two players in Shamar Stephen and Michael Pierce who do not make any impact whatsoever in the pass rush game, who are taking up over $10 million in cap space. And some other teams have signed players like Malik Collins or Jason Hargrove that were top interior rushers. And Hargrove, I think, made $39 million over 3 years. I haven't seen the details on Malik Collins' deal with the Raiders yet, but those are the guys that I would have been looking at. I think it sort of speaks back to the Mike Zimmer is really, really focused on being able to run and stop the run, which I will stand up for the run game and for fullbacks and for being able to just ground and pound when you need to. It was great to watch when San Francisco just ran all over the Green Bay Packers. It was like, yes, old school football, let's go. So I would not say that running isn't important at all and stopping the run isn't important at all. It's just that passing and stopping the pass are so much more important. And you just signed a very expensive guy who doesn't do any of that to go along with your other guy who still has a pretty decent size cap hit, who also doesn't do any of that for your interior. And I just wonder, are you going in the right direction for what is going to win in the NFL? Because your offensive side has kind of gone against that, and that might be the reason you don't have Stephon Diggs anymore. And your defensive first signing is something that goes against that too.
Would you say I don't want to use the word panicked, but do you feel like that's kind of what this move reflects? Because they're probably seeing guys fly off the board, or at least, their free agent board and all of that. Do you think that they saw this as, well, hey, this is our window, we've got to do something, because it was a need last year. They were not great against the run like they had been in previous years. Like, we saw the deterioration of their run defense, and a lot of it started up front. I mean, certainly Eric Kendricks was very, very good, and a lot of the reason he's been good in years past. I'm not taking anything away from him, but it does benefit him to have Linval Joseph playing in front of him.
For sure,
that just is what it is. But do you see this as a situation where they're like, well, we've got so many needs right now, we got to fix one of them. We might as well go this route. But I'm with you, because we talked to Mike Zimmer about this at the combine. Thought, hey, do you need to get any more interior pass rushers? And he never mentioned nose tackle by name. He's like, yeah, we're always looking for 3 techniques. I mean, well, where are you going to find those guys? I mean, because you already spent the money on Michael Pierce. You already have Shamar Stephen next to him. You're not going to be, unless you're looking towards the draft to maybe bring another one of those guys in, okay. But in the meantime, how are you going to address that in terms of what you're going to do with your pass rush? Because you can't just rely on your defensive ends always going inside. You cannot rely and say Afadi Odenigbo is going to be that answer to situationally kind of what Stephen Weatherly did last year. I mean, that's one way to solve it, but I don't know if that's a long-term thing. And maybe they're not looking for that. But to me, I don't want to use the word panicked, but it kind of feels like, well, they needed to get this move done. Why not?
Real quick, we have some Vikings breaking news that they have agreed to a contract with kicker Dan Bailey. So
yes,
that is about the most obvious of moves that we could all support. Nobody is going to debate signing a kicker who made 93% of his kicks last year. So they bring back the battery of him and Britton Colquitt that were very effective. And that is a great way to sustain your excellent kicking, is bringing back one of the best kickers in history. So good job there. Back to what you're saying. Yeah, panicked is definitely a way to put it. Like, we need to fill one of these spots, and this guy will take our contract, so let's just get this done and then move forward. Now, I want to talk about what it means to move forward in just a second here, but I just ran this. So Arif Hassan of The Athletic wrote a piece about how Zimmer's focus is trying to set other teams up on 3rd and long so he can use all of his situational pass rushers, which is a great strategy and has worked very effectively for Zimmer. Been incredible on 3rd downs over the last few years, with a lot of talent rushing the passer too, but you can scheme pressures on 3rd downs. But the issue here is that I just ran the numbers on this. Last year on 1st down, teams still threw the ball 48% of the time on 1st down. So if you have Shamar Stephen and Michael Pierce in on 1st down and the opposing team throws on 1st down, that's almost a 50-50 split. So half the time they're giving you nothing at 2 positions for $10 million.
I know, and that's the thing that I struggle to comprehend, that ever since Sheldon Richardson left, they have not been able to, generate that production any other way. Like, I know what Mike Zimmer said about being able to manufacture it. Well, they really haven't on a consistent basis, and I don't know how you do that more often in 2020, given the personnel that you do have.
Yep. And I just saw a tweet from Sam Monson kind of laying some of this out about the overall direction. And he tweets, they extend a flawed quarterback, the fullback, the punter, the kicker, franchise tag to trade their best defensive back, trade their best wide receiver, and let most of the secondary and defensive line walk. I mean, so they are in a position where I assume that Rick tells us all the time that they have a plan. So I assume that they have a plan. I just am having a tough time seeing it. Like, what is it? Is it, and if the plan is to fill a couple of spots with good players who are high character or whatever, and can have a role and do things and whatever, and then draft a heck of a lot of human beings to put in and have all those young players be the next wave that start to really show up in 2021, I can get behind that. I can definitely get behind that. But if you were going to try to win in 2020 and make all these sort of under the radar or clever signings to fill the positions, sure. I mean, that could be done and you could support that. It's just right now, neither direction seems to be fully going that way.
Well, when you asked me about this earlier in the week, and I know I was defending my take that how could they possibly be in rebuild mode, especially after the contract that they gave Kirk Cousins, the optics do not match up. Like, you don't pay a quarterback like that if you're just planning to play 2020 out and kind of burn it down and start all over. Now, they're going to have a hard time defending that if they're not already in the works and we just don't know about it yet for a big trade to either upgrade the offensive line. Maybe they're trying to bring in a corner. Who knows what they're doing, with the wide receiver position. That to me feels like they're going to address that in the draft. I don't think you need to go after Robbie Anderson or Emmanuel Sanders at this point. That's, there's money to be spent elsewhere. But they've got to be able to prove in many ways that they're not, this whole thing doesn't reflect a team that, has kind of fallen flat ever since giving Kirk Cousins a big contract extension on Monday. Like, if they still want to stay competitive, they've got to make the moves that will allow them to do so. Now this obviously helps, like we've talked about, it helps you run defense because that's been a problem, but this is a passing league. And that's one area that they have really struggled with, especially on the interior. I mean, Shamar Stephen is not known for that. I mean, they knew that when they signed him last year. Like, they have had such a problem generating that push from that 3 technique position, and they couldn't afford Sheldon Richardson another season. So I don't know how they're going to maintain that unless they think that they're just going to get some other guys in the draft and just throw everybody in there on a rotational basis. Well, good luck to you. I mean, that's hard. But if you can do it, I guess enough of the time, then then you could be in an okay spot. But it just feels like this is almost like kind of like a incomplete signing in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, if you can't create the pressure by rotating people, you're going to be in a really tough spot.